Okay, so we're diving right in today.
Let's do it.
We're looking at, this whole thing about Trump and the Department of Education. Yeah, what?
Is going on with that.
Right. And I mean, it's been talked about for a while now, but it seems like there's been a lot of kind of renewed chatter about it recently. So we thought it'd be a good time to kind of circle back and see what people are saying.
Especially because it seems like it's getting, more serious or
Yeah, gaining some.
gaining more traction. Exactly. Yeah.
And so where we went for this one was actually to Reddit.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, there was this really fascinating thread on Rask Reddit and just this very simple question like, how do you guys feel about the Department of Education being dismantled by Trump?
Straight to the point.
Yeah, and I think that's what made the response is so interesting is that, it wasn't like a super carefully worded like, policy debate or anything. It was just people kind of like gut reaction, like, what are you thinking about?
This does your gut tell you?
Yeah, and so much of it was just so like personal and real, and I think that's why we thought it would be worth kind of digging into.
Yeah, because these are real people who are going to be, if this does happen, they're going to be impacted.
Exactly. So that's kind of our mission today is to go through this thread and pull out the most common anxieties, the arguments that people making for or against it, and the potential consequences.
And the consequences, yeah.
And I think it's helpful to kind of set the stage here by just reminding folks like, what is the Department of Education? What does it actually do? Because I think we throw these terms around.
Right. People probably hear the phrase and they're like,
Yeah, I kind of know what that
is. I know it's important, but
it's important. It has something to do with schools.
yeah, but like, what does it actually do?
So, in a nutshell, this is the federal department that really for decades now has had a huge role in how education is funded across the country, right? How schools are overseen.
And really importantly, like how civil rights are protected when it comes to education.
Yes, that is huge, huge. I mean, I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today kind of comes back to this question of like, if you take that away, if you remove that federal presence, what happens? What fills that void?
Yeah, what rushes in to fill the vacuum?
Exactly. And I think one of the first things that jumped out at us looking at this Reddit thread was just how much of the initial reaction was about money.
Oh, yeah, that's the first thing everyone thinks.
Yeah, and you saw people like Lady Arundel, no, never immediately. They're like, wait a minute, what happens to the funding, right? And the specific worry that kept coming up over and over again were IEPs and 504 plans.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean,
So for folks who might not be super familiar with those, an IEP, Individualized Education Program, this is like a legal document. It's not just some casual plan. It's created for each public school child who needs special ed, and it outlines exactly what their learning needs are and what services the school has to provide.
exactly. And then 504 plans, those are a little bit broader. They ensure that students with disabilities have the accommodations they need to participate fully in school.
Right, so like maybe it's a specific kind of desk or extra time on tasks.
Exactly. Yeah, like those kinds of things. So,
So the question is, if the Department of Education goes away, what happens to the money that supports these programs?
yeah, I mean, does it just disappear?
Right, and people were asking really pointed questions about that, like, no, do you ever was saying, okay, is this about just cutting out the federal middleman, okay, and giving that same amount of money directly to the states?
Right. So it just kind of goes straight to the state.
Yeah. Or are we talking about the federal government just like not contributing that money at all anymore?
Right, which would be a huge difference, obviously.
Huge. And oh, row, your vote, and Jay Woolman, we're bringing that you too. It's like, okay, who's going to be holding the bag here? Like, where does the responsibility land?
Yeah. And if you're a state that's, maybe struggling a little bit financially, you're probably going, oh no.
And that's where this idea of taxes comes in. Yeah, you saw people like No One Never Again, Adventurous B715 ME5. They're pointing out that, okay, if the feds don't pay for it, who does?
Yes, someone has to pay for it,
And it probably means that your state and local taxes are going to go up.
which no one wants to hear, obviously.
No one wants to hear that. And they were also making this really good point, which is, maybe you'd end up paying the same amount in the end, right? But is it being spent as effectively if it's all happening at the state level?
Right. Do you have the same kind of like safeguards in place?
That federal oversight to make sure that money is being used the right way.
Especially when we're talking about something as crucial as education. Like, you don't want to be messing around with the money for that.
And this is where I think it's so interesting to kind of zoom out and think about the bigger picture of education funding across the country because it is not equal.
Right.
Like it is not the same in every state.
Absolutely not.
And this really came out on the Reddit thread.
Well, I imagine.
Yeah, Bergie Fan Club was mentioning states like Mississippi, Arkansas, West Virginia,
Yeah,
and saying like these are places that could be really, really hard hit if this.
happens. And I mean, those are states that historically have relied more on federal 08 for their schools, right?
Exactly. They just don't have the same kind of tax base as some other states. And then on the flip side, you had someone like Preform Perform who mentioned they're in California, okay, and they seem to be a little bit less worried.
Interesting.
Yeah, suggesting that California probably has the resources to kind of figure it out.
They could make up the difference potentially, yeah. But it really does underscore how unequal things are.
Right.
Because it's almost like you would have two different countries then.
Almost. And that's the thing that kept coming up over and over.
Again, like a tale of two Americans.
Yeah. You had people like Chaplin, Grills, Great Deadly Quarantine, Ad Liv 9184, all saying like this is going to hit poorer states the hardest.
Yeah, because if you're already struggling to make ends meet,
And you're depending on that federal money.
yeah, exactly. And then you take that away. I mean, what are you supposed to do? And
Aid Live 9184 specifically mentioned Montana and how a lot of their schools rely on federal funding, okay, and they're already dealing with like economic issues from terrorists and things. So it's,
like a double whammy.
yeah, it paints this picture of just a really, really tough situation for some parts of the country.
It raises this question too about, what is the role of the federal government when it comes to education? Yeah. Because, you have one commenter browser in 92 even talked about this idea of welfare states. Okay. And this concept of like financially decoupling states entirely. Wow. Like each state is responsible for itself completely, no matter what.
So like, if you're a poor state, tough luck.
Yeah, essentially. Wow.
That's a pretty radical idea.
It is. It's definitely a fringe viewpoint.
But it is worth noting that, as Vape Guy pointed out, the feds only pay for about 9% of nationwide school costs. Okay, so it's not the majority, right? But for specific programs like special ed, and for states that are already struggling, that 9% can be everything.
It can be make or break, absolutely.
Okay, so I wanted to shift gears a little bit, but stay focused on this idea of like who might be most vulnerable if this actually happens, okay? And honestly, the Reddit thread was just dominated by concerns about special education.
Yeah, that's not surprising. I mean, it was.
Like one of the biggest things that kept coming up.
Well, when you think about it, like students with disabilities, they often need more resources, more support. And if you're talking about cutting funding, that's where people are going to get really worried.
And it's striking just how many people brought it up. Lady Arundel crying Chronic Crimson 420, and like so many others. And they're all expressing this deep anxiety about what could happen if the Department of Education goes away. And in the core fear seems to be this potential loss of FEAFAFI. So that stands for free and appropriate public education. This is a right that's guaranteed under federal law, specifically the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So IDEA, and a lot of that relies on federal funding and federal oversight to make sure that states are actually meeting their obligations to these students.
Oh, without that federal kind of like stick, yeah, there's a worry that states might just be like, well,
Yeah, we don't have the money for
that, yeah, or it's not a priority.
and that could mean weaker legal protections for these kids.
Exactly. And, we're not just talking about like a tiny group of students here. Eris Tenebrae made a really good point about this, saying that special ed is actually a really broad term. It includes kids with mild to moderate learning and behavior disorders, kids who maybe haven't even been diagnosed yet, English language learners, students in Title I programs, which are those programs that support low-income schools.
That's a lot of people. It's a
Huge chunk of the student population.
and the fear is that without those federal requirements in place, right? There's going to be this push to just mainstream all these kids without giving the teachers the resources and the support they need to actually help them.
And I mean, if you're a teacher and you suddenly have all these kids with different needs,
And you're not trained for it.
yeah, and you don't have the resources, it's not good for anyone,
Casey Dew brought that up and said, this could actually end up hurting all the students.
right? Because it's just chaos in the classroom.
Yeah, it's not fair to anyone, not at all. And what really got to me were some of the just personal stories, like Cry Ren in Alabama and Elegant Pressure 290 from another red state. They were sharing their fears for kids with special needs.
That's heartbreaking.
It is, and it just makes it so real. It's not just like a theoretical policy debate
These are real lives.
These are families who are like, what is going to happen to my kid?
Yeah, and it's not just the students either, right? Soulstone mentioned that their sister, who works as a special ed aide, oh wow, had already gotten a notice that her job might be cut
Oh no.
if the federal funding goes away.
So we could see people losing their jobs too.
Absolutely. And those are people who are dedicated to helping these students.
Yeah, so it's a ripple effect.
Yeah, it's a whole ecosystem.
Okay, so beyond the whole like money issue and the special ed concerns, that's huge, huge. The other big thing that kept coming up was this question of equity and civil rights. Like, what is the Department of Education do to make sure that everyone is getting a fair shot, right, regardless of their background?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big one.
Yeah, and we saw people like the Gapster 2000 Emsburner phoned White Rabbit. They were all really worried about losing that federal guarantee of civil rights.
Right, because right now the Department of Education has a whole office dedicated to that.
The Office for Civil Rights.
Exactly. And they investigate complaints of discrimination based on race, color, national origin, sex, disability, age.
So it's a pretty wide net.
It is. It's there to protect students from all kinds of discrimination.
And so White Rabbit was saying that if you get rid of the department, it's going to be so much harder to fight those battles.
Yeah, because who do you go to then?
Right, like who's in charge, who's enforcing those rules?
And I mean, it's not hard to imagine that in some states they might not be as eager to enforce those rules.
Yeah, and that's where you get into this whole question of segregation and unequal access to good schools, right? And a lot of commenters were bringing this up hot. U7366, Shara Kashir, Papaya Pioneer, and they were drawing parallels to the history of segregation in this country.
Oh, wow, yeah.
I mean, and saying, if you don't have that federal oversight, we can end up going backwards.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen this in other areas too, right? Where if you kind of loosen the reins too much, things can start to backslide.
Yeah, and especially for kids from poor families, minority families, they could end up in schools that are just not as good.
And that just perpetuates the cycle of inequality.
Yeah, it's really scary to think about. And what's interesting is how many people tied this whole thing to school vouchers.
Okay.
We had Unusual Flounder, 2073, Pastek, Amrod, all saying that if you get rid of the Department of Education, it could lead to a huge expansion of voucher programs.
And just so we're clear, vouchers are when you take public tax dollars and you use them to pay for private schools.
Often religious schools.
Often religious schools, exactly.
And people were really worried about this for a few reasons.
Well, I can imagine.
Yeah, first of all, there's the whole separation of church and state thing, right? Like, is it okay to use public money to fund religious education?
Yeah, that's a big
question. And then there's the worry that vouchers actually benefit wealthy families more.
How so?
Well, because they can afford to supplement the voucher amount, okay? So they can send their keys to these fancy private schools, right? And the kids who are left behind in the public schools are the ones who can't afford to do that.
So it creates even more of a divide.
Exactly. And the other thing people were pointing out is that this could actually undermine some really important legal decisions. Yeah, like Brown v. Board of Education, right? Which was the whole case that desegregated schools.
Okay. Yeah, that's huge.
And protections under Title IX.
Which prohibits sex-based discrimination.
Right. And Title III, which is about discrimination based on national origin.
So basically, you're saying that vouchers could allow schools to discriminate and get away with it?
Yeah, because they're not technically public schools anymore.
Wow, that's really scary.
And Pastek even shared this story about Kansas trying to ban Muslim and Jewish schools from a voucher program.
Wow, so it's not just a theoretical concern.
Yeah, it's already happening.
Wow, okay, so obviously a lot of people are really worried about this.
Yeah, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, there is another side to this argument, okay? And that's the whole idea of local control, like let the states decide.
And that was definitely perspective that came up in the Reddit thread. Oh, yeah.
You had people like Mike Messiah making this argument, saying that education should be handled at the state and local level.
Closer to the people.
Yeah, and their point is that a big federal bureaucracy hasn't really made things better, okay? and that local communities are better equipped to figure out what their schools need.
Right, because they know their students, their families.
Yeah, and they don't need the feds telling them what to do.
Okay, I can see that perspective.
But of course, there's a counter-argument to that.
Well, yeah, I mean,
You had people like Chungling Setzerberger saying, wait a minute.
what if every state is doing its own thing?
Yeah, and you end up with this totally patchwork system where the quality of education is totally different depending on where you live,
Right, like you could have some states that are doing amazing things.
and some that are not.
Exactly. And if you happen to live in one of the bad states, you're kind of out of luck.
And that's where this worry about standards comes in. Like without some kind of national baseline, you could see some states just letting things slide,
Which would be bad for the students, obviously.
and bad for the country as a whole.
Yeah, because you need an educated workforce.
And there was also this element of distrust, I think, okay, like Captain of Pizza tenor sounds. They were saying, you know what, this local control thing, yeah, it might not really be about empowering communities. Okay, it could be about imposing certain agendas,
How interesting.
like maybe pushing for more religious influence in schools, okay, or limiting what's taught about science.
Interesting. So it's like a Trojan horse almost.
Yeah, and some fun maths had this great anecdote about Arkansas history, okay, being this like totally useless class taught by a football coach.
Oh, no, which,
Just really illustrates what can happen if you let standards get too lax.
yeah, that's not a good sign.
And then there was this recurring fear of religious indoctrination. Oh, wow, like OC Distribution 6175, Sanchi Nai, they were worried about that,
Yeah, I mean, that's a valid concern.
especially if you don't have the feds there to kind of step in, right? So it's a lot to think about.
It is, and it goes way beyond just like what happens in the classroom.
Right. This whole conversation about education, it's tied up with so many bigger political and economic issues. Absolutely. And you know what's really interesting is how many people on Reddit connected this to those bigger issues.
Like what specifically?
Well, you had people like Adventurous, B7000, 155, Double Bacon Key, and several others saying that this is all about tax cuts for the wealthy. Okay. They're saying that the goal is to free up federal money so that they can give tax breaks to rich people.
Interesting. So they see it as part of a bigger economic agenda.
Exactly.
And I mean, that's a perspective that comes up a lot when you talk about cuts to social programs.
Yeah, and it makes you think like, okay, is this really about making education better, right? Or is it about something else entirely?
And then you had some even more cynical views. Oh, yeah, like Chapman Grill Scratch suggested that maybe this is about making people easier to control. Oh, wow. Like if you keep people uneducated, right? They're easier to manipulate.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty dark view of things.
It is, but it was out there.
And it's not entirely implausible, yeah. And then confessing, Tosin's brought up this idea of brain drain, okay, which is basically when educated people start leaving a certain area, right? Because the schools are bad.
Yeah, and that can have a huge impact on the economy.
Yeah, it becomes a downward spiral.
And then some people even brought up history. Oh, yeah, like Alt Phyllis Schrin, Robden. They were talking about states' rights and Civil War. Wow. They're saying that this whole debate is just a continuation of that same tension.
Between the federal government and the states, exactly. And then there's this thing called Project 2025. Oh,
I've never heard of that.
yeah, Stormtag and Cap Pilot mentioned it. Okay, and it's basically like this blueprint for a very specific political agenda.
Oh, interesting.
So the point is that this is all tied up with a lot of other stuff.
Yeah, it's not just about education in a vacuum.
But it is worth remembering that, you know, to actually dismantle whole federal department, like the Department of Education, yeah, it's not that easy, right? Like Mike Messiah, Bitter, Whole 7290, they're pointing out that Congress would have to approve it. Okay? And it would probably face a ton of legal challenges.
Right, because it's a pretty big deal to just get rid of a whole department.
Yeah, and then we zoom out even further and think about the global picture. Okay, you had people like Going Blind Paint by Numbers saying, you know what, if this makes America's education system worse, we could lose our edge in the world.
Right, because other countries are investing heavily in education.
And we could fall behind.
Yeah, that's a real concern for the future.
It is, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, not everyone on Reddit was like completely freaking out about this.
Okay, so there was a different perspective?
Yeah, there's some people who had more nuanced views.
Like what?
Well, you had pre-former reformer Skippy Dippy Doo took away too. They were all saying that, you know, state-level education policy can work okay, and they question whether the federal system is really that effective. Like Mike Messiah was saying, that we've spent a lot of money at the federal level, but it's not clear if it's actually made things better.
So their argument is that maybe the feds are just getting in a way?
Yeah, and Skippy Dippy Doo even shared a personal story about a red state where they saw improvements in education.
Oh, interesting.
And they said it was because of state and local efforts.
So they're saying it can be done without the feds?
Yeah, and then we had Canolioso, who has sisters who work in education, okay? And they said that some teachers actually see the Department of Education as like an unnecessary middleman.
Interesting.
Like it's just another layer of bureaucracy that doesn't really help.
So they're kind of in favor of getting rid of.
Well, they made this really important distinction, which is that there's a difference between completely getting rid of the department, yeah, okay, and reforming it.
Okay.
Like maybe there's a way to streamline things?
Right, make it more efficient.
Yeah, give more power to the states, but still have some federal oversight.
Okay, so it's not necessarily an all or nothing situation.
Right, and I think that's a really important point to keep in mind.
Yeah, because there might be a middle ground here.
But even the people who are open to change, they were still acknowledging that there are huge risks involved.
Especially for those vulnerable students we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. Like if you don't do this carefully and if states don't step up and provide the funding, things could get really bad.
Absolutely.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into the Reddit conversation, it's really clear that this whole thing about dismantling the Department of Education, yeah, it sparked a lot of anxiety and debate. And I think the core tension here is this question of how do you balance local control with the need for federal oversight?
Right, because on the one hand, you want to give communities more say in their schools. Yeah, but on the other hand, you need to make sure that everyone is getting a fair shot.
And that standards are being maintained exactly, and that civil rights are being protected.
And that's a tough balance to strike.
It is, and what really struck me about this Reddit thread, which is the sheer range of voices and how much this issue matters to people. Yeah, you have parents who are worried about their kids.
Future, especially parents of kids with special needs.
Yeah, you have teachers who are worried about their resources and their ability to do their jobs, and you have citizens all across the political spectrum who are grappling with what this could mean for the country.
Yeah, because it's a really fundamental question about what kind of society we want to be.
Exactly, and so I think the question for you listening is, what do you think? Yeah. Like, what role should the federal government play in education?
What are your non-negotiables?
Yeah, what are the things that absolutely have to be in place to make sure that every kid gets a good education?
Regardless of where they live or who they are? Yeah.
These are big questions, and there are no easy answers.
But they're questions that we all need to be thinking about.
Yeah. So thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Yeah, this is a good one.
And we encourage you to keep the conversation going.
Absolutely.
Think about it, talk about
it, and maybe even check out that Reddit thread for yourself.
Yeah, it's worth a read.
It is.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
See ya.